Questions to try to respect the time because yesterday we wished to start at 9 o'clock, but you have tried your best, but still we are still waiting others to join. Some are coming, maybe some are facing the traffic jam, but we wish to start our session for today because it is an interesting one. We don't miss any presentation and comment. Before starting with the presentation for today, I would like to make a quick recap for yesterday's session. I think most of you, or we have new participants today, but who wish to know exactly the key point that has been discussed yesterday. For day one, as you know, we started with high-level opening of the symposium with the officials from German Embassy Headquarters, Head of Cooperation, together with the opening remarks from the Ministry of Environment by the DG Environment and the Climate Change Department. After the high-level openings, we had the keynote addresses from Dr. Bamba and from the DDG and UNFCCC focal person for STEM Munyazikwiye. They tried to enter the audience about the key business of the symposium, where Bamba presented about the climate science and the climate change, and Foster complemented how the climate science and the researches are integrated into the climate policy, which is the business mainly of REMA. After that, they tried to explain and also showed us the needs, what they need for the scientists and the researchers in general. I'm not going to repeat because you will have time also to get the report, but everyone who is sitting here has homework to do, either in publication of the researches, either also to use the existing infrastructure or existing platform that are already in place so that the findings can be inform the public, but also the decision makers. After that, we had a good panel discussion meant to advancing climate research networking in Rwanda. We had Prof. Beth, we had Eric, we had Dej Meteo, we had Mrs. Caroline Reyes from Triple GI, we had also Dr. Bamba. For those who participated yesterday, you remember how the panel was very good and engaging, and also they tried to go deeply in how they use the researchers' findings and what roles they played so that the findings from the researchers are integrated into policy. Another session we had yesterday was about the parallel breakaway sessions, where we had stream A and stream B. Stream A was discussing about measurement, reduction of greenhouse gas emission, whereas stream B were discussing about observation and modeling and climate changes. All those streams were very, very, very interesting, and also we have think that even the time maybe was very short compared to the presentation, the findings, because there is too much work that has been done on the matter related to climate change, but also to modeling, climate change modeling. We have seen that you have different researches and the findings, and we have seen that this is a real-time or symposium will be a good network, a good connection to integrate what the work that already in place, the work that are discussed in different journals, so that they can be gathered in the platform or data set that will be for everyone who wish to work on the climate. The last session was about the funding and support to climate research presented by Dr. Rui, because we have seen that even those researchers, they need the funding so that they can make quality researches, so that they have to access the accessibility of existing finding and the opportunities in place. That session also was very interesting because we have seen that most of the time people are not aware of the existing opportunities in place, either in Rwanda or worldwide, or other funders that wish to contribute to the good researches and the quality works. I think that was mainly the key points discussed yesterday. I would like to start the session for today with welcoming Prof. Beth, who is going to show us the importance and linking climate action with biodiversity action. A round of applause to Dr. Beth.
Thank you very much. I'm really happy to be here talking about biodiversity and about climate change. And let's see, I hope this will work. Yeah. So I wanted to start by something kind of basic. What is biodiversity? Because it's kind of the basis or the premise for my whole presentation. So biodiversity are, in part, the living world around us. So species, but also the diversity of the genes in those species. We can also talk about the diversity of communities or ecosystems or landscapes, but it's also about the interactions. That's what's actually very key about thinking about biodiversity. It's not just counting up the number of species. And that is because of, I don't know if this, anyway, with the red arrows, that is a species. You see a tree, and it's doing something. It's the interactions. It's growing leaves, the leaves drop, they fall to the ground, they put nutrients in the soil. Those are things that are happening. So it's the species and then the things that they are doing in the environment. And those things lead to, on the right-hand side, that's your right-hand side, ecosystem services. And those are things we rely on. That's the link I really want to make. It's about species, the diversity of those species, the diversity of ecosystems, landscapes, and then the services that are provided when they get to be together and do things, meaning they function, they break down nutrients, they photosynthesize, they sequester carbon, they provide pollination services, medicines, etc. And we always thought about them in this form of ecosystem services. But more recently, maybe I need to aim it that way. Yeah. We are encouraged to think about it as nature's contributions to people. And it's essentially the same as ecosystem services. But biodiversity or nature gives us things, us people, things that we need. And that could be in the form of regulatory services for climate, air quality, clean water, the food we need, etc. And this is from the IPBS, one of their reports. And so it shows directly that biodiversity is contributing to the quality of life on Earth. And where should I be pointing this? Doesn't always seem to work. Oh, there. Okay. And now, what I also wanted to talk about are the, oops, I don't know what's happening here. Sorry. Yeah, okay. What we know about biodiversity loss. There is definitely evidence that we are losing biodiversity. Some people say, oh, that's been happening over time. We have never experienced a loss of biodiversity as what we are experiencing in the last 100 years or so. And we also know that biodiversity increases the stability of ecosystem function. I'm not saying the stability of ecosystems. I'm saying the stability of their functioning. Remember those red arrows? So the things that species do in a community, the things they do, that stability is ensured when you have biodiversity, meaning they're continuing to provisions nature's contributions to people or ecosystem services. And the impact of biodiversity on any single ecosystem process is nonlinear and saturating. That just means that the change will accelerate, meaning because it's so interconnected, the more we lose biodiversity, and the more change that occurs, the more rapidly we will lose biodiversity. So it's kind of a feedback loop. And diverse communities are more productive. That's important also because when you think about planting, for example, a plantation and you want to get services from that plantation, we are used to planting one species, but all the ecological evidence shows that diversity of species, even in a plantation, will give us more benefits. And I want to show you this also from the IPBS. And this is hard to read. It was taken from the report. But the main thing to show are the arrows pointing down are, over time, the negative impact. These are global trends and the ability of biodiversity or the ability of nature to provide these services going down. Most of those services going down: pollination, seed dispersal, the maintenance of habitat quality, etc. There's very few that are going up, if any. And there's an average of 25%, a quarter of all the species that have been assessed, both plants and animals, are threatened. So globally, we have the IUCN Red List, which is assessing species globally. And of course, we have millions of species, so they can't do everything. And when here, if we focus on animal and plant groups, a quarter of the ones that are assessed are threatened. That means about 1 million are facing extinction. And we consider that we are in an extinction crisis right now, given the number of species we are losing. And by 2016, we lost about 10% of the diversity of domesticated mammals and plants that we use. So we're reducing the diversity even of the domesticated livestock and plants we use. Many wild crops are being lost. This is important because that diversity also enables adaptation to climate change. If you only have one species that is adapted to one particular environment, we are reducing our ability to be resilient, to be adaptive to climate change. Biological communities are more similar to each other in managed and unmanaged systems across the globe today. And you can see that here in Rwanda when you drive across the landscape. Mostly you can count on your hands the number of trees you will see, even though we are in a biodiversity hotspot. You will only see a few species. So we have what we call biotic homogenization. That is also reducing the adaptive capacity of our ecosystems and our landscape. And that's not just unique to here, that's happening all around the globe. And I want to show you some maps that we worked on with some different partners. And the brown is showing not natural habitat, and the blue is natural habitat. So this is based on that pre-industrial period, similar to what, if you were here yesterday, Bamba showed a map where they look at climate change and they start with 1892 maybe. So when we look at the potential vegetation of East Africa, and we can focus in on Rwanda, for example, we can see that, of course, most of the country was covered in natural vegetation, and today we only have isolated pockets. Isolated meaning they're not connected. There's very little connectivity. And these are mainly now national parks and some wetlands. And then this is the ecosystem threat status that we did following the IUCN ecosystem threat scale. And some of you may recognize, like, the orange is the shape of Nyungwe, and that's because Nyungwe is a particular ecosystem type, actually composed of several, but that used to be spread across much of the central, from the south to the north. And that's why it's considered endangered, because although Nyungwe is very well protected, Rwanda has very good protection of national park, but it's considered under this, the process for doing this threat status of ecosystems, it's all that's left. There's very little bits of it remaining relative to what used to be here in the country. And that means that all of those species that were there are also no longer in the areas they used to be. Some of them may be gone. I'm talking about maybe small, like insects and smaller species, and even plants that were more isolated. So the rate of global change in nature during the past 50 years is unprecedented in history. And again, this is mirrored by what's happening with climate change. And now the drivers are change in land and sea use. That means hunting, cutting forest, burning grasslands, or changing grasslands into forest. Direct exploitation of organisms, that means hunting, climate change, pollution, invasion of alien species. And these drivers are underpinned by what we do as humans. That's our societal values and behaviors. And I want to focus here because this also came out in the Global Biodiversity Framework and in the IPBES assessment. It's really about our relationship to nature. You know, you can really get down to it and ask, like, how could we be letting this happen? I was yesterday reading about tipping points, and like, we've surpassed 6 of the 9 tipping points on Earth for climate change. And those have also direct impacts on biodiversity. Do we get out in nature? Do we actually value nature? And even how we do business, how business impacts. I'm going to get back to that a little bit. But the point is, we really have to address climate change and biodiversity loss together. And a lot of that is about our behavior, how we manage what we need, energy, food, clothing, etc. So climate change is a direct driver of biodiversity loss, and it then affects also human well-being and the increasing temperatures, weather events. Yesterday we heard really great talks about that. So these have different impacts. They affect species distribution. Some species simply cannot exist at that temperature. We can start asking that about us humans. If the prediction is like around Kigali, if it was 32 degrees regularly, would we really be able to sustain that, or what would we need to do to sustain that? How is it going to affect our behavior? Also phenology, the production of leaves, flowers, and fruits, which serve as food for animals and animals and humans, population dynamics, ecosystem function are all going to be affected by temperature and extreme weather events, changes in precipitation. And I want to show you some data that we were working with. It's a 24-year data set from Nyungwe Forest, Nyungwe National Park. And the main thing to focus on here is that the graph is trending up. And the 3 different groups are mainly the different functional groups of trees. So some trees are slow growing, shade tolerant. Other trees are fast growing, shade intolerant. But regardless, they were all producing more fruit. Now that's really interesting because some forests, like in Gabon, they found that trees over time, also in a long data set, I think 20 years or more, fruit production was dropping, in particular for elephants, and it was showing a negative impact on elephants. But in Nyungwe, we're seeing an increase. But there's so much yet we don't know. We're just scratching the surface here. We don't know if the fruit quality remains the same. So trees, the temperature is heating up. They are photosynthesizing, so physiologically they're warm and they're doing more, and they seem to be producing more fruit. But also in Nyungwe, there's a strong elevational gradient going from maybe 1,600 meters all the way up to almost 3,000 meters. So the phenology pattern is not all the same across that elevation gradient. This has all the species pooled. So we don't yet know the implications of this change on fruit quality and on the availability for animals, and why this is important in general, why climate change, and what we know that it will be impacting phenology, meaning the production of leaves, the production of flowers, the production of fruits, which pollinators, animals, humans rely on. In particular, for example, in Rwanda, tourism based on the great apes, in particular mountain gorillas, but also chimpanzees, is very important for the economy and very important for conservation. It's really an amazing model. But we don't yet know exactly how climate change is going to affect their environments or their food availability. And this is an area that really needs a lot more research so that we could build in the capacity of these national parks to accommodate climate change. This is a schematic showing the global extinction risk of different species groups. So the top is fish, and then it goes down to different taxonomic groups. But the main thing to look at is where there's red and orange all the way up to the light green. All those categories go from critically endangered to least concern, the light green. Those are the ones to focus on because we don't know exactly the status of every population everywhere. So we may say it's near threatened, for example, but we don't know exactly how serious that is always. So the range from the red to the light green for many taxonomic groups is half of all of the groups in that taxon group, half of all the species are either critically endangered or near threatened. And the graphs on the bottom show that stark increase in extinction. And that's also very similar to the climate change graphs we were looking at, where in the last period of time on the graphs that Bamba showed, there's a very rapid increase in temperature. And also over this period, this shows from the 1500s, the increase in the loss of different species. So how does climate change affect biodiversity? Well, rising temperatures, as we talked about, changes in the pattern of rain. So there might be the same amount of rain, but it comes maybe in very discrete, shorter, very, very heavy rainfall events. Also, the rapid pace of climate change in our century with this temperature rise over 3 degrees, which is possible in this century, could mean many species fail to adapt or fail to be able to migrate or move. And some plant and animal species may become extinct due to this issue. And then on the other side, how does biodiversity affect climate change? So species present in an ecosystem, they have an impact. They alter the properties of the land surface and the flows of energy. Simply what that means is if you have lots of trees, they're going to be doing their thing and dropping leaves and providing nutrients in the soil. If there's less of them, there's going to be less of that happening. So vegetation increases the rate of water cycling, which lowers surface temperatures. That's why when we talk about green growth or urbanization, I really like to include in that the importance of vegetation in there. And that moderates, in the immediate effect, the climate around us. And I think you know what that means. If you're standing out in a cemented parking lot in the sun, you can hardly stand that for more than a couple of minutes. But that same parking lot, if it had, say, a permeable surface with trees around it, that's going to be a very different feeling environment, or a microclimate. So at a larger scale, these features, the kind of vegetation you have in the area, affect the atmospheric circulation, and we know that is true. More vegetated areas versus less vegetated areas have a large-scale impact. So ecosystems, through their vegetation and their animals and microbes in the soils, are major reservoirs of carbon. That's also another relationship with the climate and climate change. So we know as we start removing vegetation, we can have a big impact on those carbon reserves, or carbon reservoirs. The total amount of carbon stored in the terrestrial biosphere is 3 times that found in the atmospheric carbon dioxide. That again really emphasize how important it is to protect our vegetation that we have, and to restore the areas that have been degraded and lost their vegetation. And biodiversity within ecosystems makes them more resilient to climate change. And that's something that ecologists had been really debating for a long time, but evidence really shows now, and there's a concurrence or an agreement among ecologists, that the more diversity we have in an ecosystem, the more resilient that ecosystem is. So a simple example is a wetland that has lost all its native vegetation, has a lot of bare soil. When you have a heavy rainfall event, what's going to happen? There will be probably some erosion. Maybe that wetland will be unable to absorb the water that's coming in. There could be flooding. When you have that wetland intact with its native vegetation and vegetation cover, it can be able to absorb that heavy rainfall and be more resilient. So how biodiversity supports climate adaptation? For mitigation, that would really be about what species we plant. And when we think about it in terms of biodiversity, maybe instead of planting, a monoculture of one species, we can measure how much carbon it absorbs. We can say that could be a good species, but thinking about that in terms of using multiple species, where we get multiple benefits, not only on the side of mitigation. And adaptation, I'm going to talk about that a little bit more as well right now. So I think most of us have heard of nature-based solutions, or acronym is NBS, nature-based solutions. They're meant to protect sustainable management, they restore ecosystems, and address societal challenges, mostly challenges around climate change, and provide for human well-being. But it's very important with these projects that we consider also the biodiversity, and not just the species that might be fast-growing, because most of those might be non-native species. So we're missing out on the opportunity to include biodiversity there. But what's interesting, some of the statistics show more projects, more nature-based solution projects at a large scale are estimated to result in a potential net absorption of about 11 billion tons of carbon. That's about, per year until the mid-century, it's equivalent to 27% of the total current fossil fuel emissions. That's pretty amazing. Essentially what it means is working on restoring ecosystems and making them function again so that they can be absorbing carbon, while also provisioning those nature's contributions to people. And I want to turn to a few instruments and strategies that Rwanda has, which link climate change and biodiversity. I think Rwanda is a really great example of some of the opportunities. And there's also spaces for lessons learned. So in the nationally determined contributions, biodiversity is mentioned in there, mainly around like reducing the pressure on biodiversity by reducing pressure on, say, getting fuel wood, and that would protect biodiversity. And then there's also adaptation interventions in the baselines, which can really be emphasized here. I think biodiversity is a very important part of the NDCs. And also for the National Adaptation Plan, here it's very, to me, very front and center biodiversity. There's talk about sustainable food production, about soil fertility, forest management, water resource management, restoration, disaster risk management. All of those can really benefit from thinking about biodiversity. What species are appropriate? Where should they be placed in terms of restoration plans? And how they can contribute to the functioning of that system so that it contributes to the National Adaptation Plan. And the green growth and climate resilience strategy, this is also where biodiversity becomes very important, and I think particularly when we realize that urbanization is happening very rapidly around the globe and on the continent of Africa, in Rwanda, that green urbanization or green growth is very important, and that really also can really put front and center the importance of biodiversity and understanding those linkages of biodiversity with climate change. Again, that it can help to moderate as our environments become hotter and hotter. It can help to moderate those climates for the temperature, water, air moisture, etc. And what's also really exciting is that Rwanda recently joined the IPBS, that's the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. This was just a couple of weeks ago. This is really a fantastic opportunity for Rwanda to really up its game in terms of biodiversity and research, and then the linkages with climate change. And they're also, for example, they're having this new plenary discussion for Africa, Science and Evidence to Address Global Biodiversity Crisis. On their website, they have lots and lots of really great reports. It's really considered the equivalent to the IPCC reports, and I really encourage any of you Rwandan scientists to get involved. You can join a panel and contribute to these reports. So also from another fairly recent paper, we have this new global biodiversity framework. In response to that, countries are redoing their National Biodiversity Strategy and Action Plan, the NBSAP, and Rwanda has embarked on that as well. And unfortunately, the table that I copied out, it's really hard to see, but it's showing the targets. And then what I like about this is it actually shows how you would measure the target in terms of biodiversity. So that might be like an aspect of ecosystem function or species presence, but also the climate change mitigation that it contributes. So it's really explicitly connecting biodiversity and the CBD, especially the Global Biodiversity Framework targets, and climate mitigation and adaptation. So in ending, I wanted to talk about some specific suggestions, things I had been thinking about. One of them is there was a paper that recently came out. It was Getting Beyond Biodiversity as an Afterthought, and I love that so much because a lot of times when we do these actions, whether it's doing landscaping or restoring a wetland, a river buffer, there's a lot of focus on the mechanics of it and how it's going to get done, all that. But often biodiversity is forgotten. And I think that means that it's what species that were native to that region could be planted. And that's because maybe we don't always know. Maybe we're not talking to each other, those that are implementing projects and then those that know about the biodiversity. But I think that we can think in terms of co-benefits. So the benefit might be the adaptive capacity or resilience is built, and if you use native species, if you also think about biodiversity, you're getting the benefits that are biodiversity conservation, promoting native species, acknowledging traditional knowledge, because often people can start to see native species that they have grown up with, that are in their culture. And we also need to pay attention to avoiding biotic homogenization. I mentioned this earlier, but it's that use of, like in agroforestry, maybe 5 species all the time, the same 5 species, and that are not even native to Rwanda. So yes, those species can have value. Now many farmers like them and want them, but why not consider also introducing native species where those farmers also have some traditional knowledge about those species and could benefit from mixing that more. We also need studies on the relationship between species biodiversity and ecosystem services. So for example, does a riparian zone dominated by one species, bamboo from China, provision the same nature's contributions to people or ecosystem services as a more diverse riparian zone planting? And what about the impacts on climate change? How does it do in terms of soil, controlling soil erosion or flooding, for example, or even carbon sequestration on the mitigation side? I also think that it would be really important to leverage institutions in Rwanda. Rwanda has a UNESCO Category 2 research institution, the Center of Excellence in Biodiversity and Natural Resource Management. There's also, I see some of my colleagues in the room, like there's a Center for GIS here. There's many other centers of excellence in the country. It's actually an amazing environment for research, and I think what really needs to happen are events like this that bring people together to talk. There's a space agency here. There's the Mateo Rwanda agency, and actually a lot of really great data to start understanding these relationships and what are the best practices. And another thing that I want to talk about more maybe from my side, and I'm an ecologist, biodiversity scientist, is the importance of developing biological indicators. And in the Center of Excellence in Biodiversity, we have started that, and I know it will continue. It would be really great to see that integrated into Rwanda Water Resource Board, into the Rwanda Forestry Authority, et cetera, where we can start monitoring and even have early warning or early indicators of change in the environment, because some species we know when they are present, they are indicating something is changing. And then another one is to get active on this new IPBS platform. So other countries that are members, they have a national platform. It brings together scientists who respond to the reports that come out. So when a report comes out, it's done at a global level. How does that get translated down to what's happening in Rwanda, for example? And how can we use that science? And does that science apply to every aspect here? So there's a lot of opportunity. And I just wanted to put this figure, and I couldn't resist, but for me, it really emphasizes this idea that, for example, we know like a reference forest, maybe you can think about Gishwati Mukura or Nyungwe, for example, or any other intact forest. It's going to be high in biodiversity, water quality, carbon sequestration, et cetera. But what's really interesting is when you get down here to agroforestry, if you can do it well, you can still get a lot of co-benefits in biodiversity and carbon and timber and food. And I'm going to emphasize here that that would be paying attention to biodiversity. So you can get climate adaptation and mitigation benefits. You can get livelihood improvement and biodiversity. And I think this is my last slide, just to bring this back to nature positive. This is, for me, really thinking about human behavior, like how we are interacting with the environment and with business. And now there's really a lot of push to think about nature positive and how we do our activities, our behaviors. And we definitely need more research in this area. Sustainable modes of production and consumption practices, and there's some evidence that we can have a big impact if we change some of the ways that we function in terms of carbon emissions and promoting biodiversity. That's those co-benefits again. So I wanted to end with a thank you and just this nice diagram that I also really like because it's kind of showing that everything sits on biodiversity. Isn't that true? We're sitting here on Earth. Earth is biodiversity. Of course, we have a big impact on it, but we also can take care of it and interact with it. But everything is deriving from there all the way up to the sustainable development and human well-being. So thank you, and I really appreciate your attention. Okay, I can take some questions. Yes, please. Oh, do I give you?
Thank you so much. Good morning. My name is Leonard, and my question is on the thing that you mentioned about behavior, people's behavior. For me, I'm sorry, sometimes I live for researchers as visitors of nature, because sometimes we go and do research for a certain time and then you move. But I'm worried about mostly people who are living with nature, local and grassroots communities, because I tried to do some studies about behaviors and people's knowledge about certain topics like biodiversity and climate change. I think one of the studies that I did was about the birds, people's perceptions and attitudes about birds around one of the national park. But surprisingly, this was before COVID-19, and what I find is that most of the people, they have negative attitude, and they hate birds, and they play killer in many laws that our forest needs, catching even pests and so many others. So even when we are sitting here, most of us, we are fearful because we are going to lose so many biodiversity and plants and whatever, and some of them we never care, like as researchers. I may give you an example of one of the species, which is water lily. I know you know this, which is found in Bugarama, only in Rwanda. And me and my colleagues, we are trying to do a movie that will be showcasing this water lily, which is in a threat. So, and today we are fearful because we are going to shoot this in July, but we are wondering, what if we go there and we miss it? Because it's threatened. So my question is, what do you think should be a mind changer, or what should be the tool for changing people's perceptions, myth, and negative attitude toward biodiversity? Because it seems like we have so many species that are threatened by that, even if they are also threatened by climate change, but we are adding these negative attitudes. Thanks.
Really great question, and I thank you for all your work in biodiversity conservation and climate change. I don't have the answer to that big question, but I have a few ideas. One is, I'm thinking in the big picture, so I understand where you went with this idea of behavior change and how people may be negative to animals, like out in the forest. And by the way, researchers also live in nature. But I'm thinking about this in a big scale. So, for example, plastic. When plastic was developed, it was like, oh my God, this is an amazing product. Like, we can put food and water in it, we can take it everywhere, we can put it in the microwave, in the refrigerator, in the freezer, we can travel long distances with it, and it had more and more uses. It got to be Ziploc bags and saran wrap, and it's used everywhere for everything, and everyone has it. And then all of a sudden it was like, oh my God, now it doesn't go away. And in fact, it's having a really bad impact. And I'm thinking, how is it that you can design things without thinking about the end line, like what is going to happen to that thing? And that's the same with so many products, like chemical fertilizers or chemicals that we use for pest control, or in paints, for example. We know all that material is getting out into the environment. Why are we not teaching our students to think about that whole cycle of what's going to happen to it? How could you develop something that you wouldn't think about the impact it's going to have on the environment, whether it's biodiversity or climate change? And that's the big problem we have. We're not taking that into consideration. That's something I think. And another thing is to just teach people all along the way, like through education, what is biodiversity, how does our Earth function, and Earth systems, and what are the impacts of our behaviors? Because I think a lot of times in design, engineering, development, that's not part of the training and how we think about doing things. That's why we produce a lot of materials that even in construction, I do know of one building here in Kigali, I think it's M&E Bank, I hope I got the acronym right, which is a green building. If you haven't been in there, you should go in there. It's really cool, and it has no air conditioning, but it's so cool the way it was built. Like, why aren't all buildings being built that way? Like, doesn't that make more sense? But I think that's just not part of the normal thinking and process. So that's what I mean by behavior as usual. But the other thing I think that's really important, addressing more maybe what you're talking about, is that I think a lot of times people have become very separated from nature. So I'm not talking about maybe people who are living in a forest or farmers who are living every day, but more like a lot of times I ask my students when I'm teaching, I could have a classroom of 100 students, can you name 5 plant species native to Rwanda? No. Any birds? No. Like, how can that be? And then how can you convince people to protect them if you can't even name them or know what we have? So that's a big problem. So I think we also really have to work on, realizing where we are, where we live, that this is planet Earth, this is what we have, and we need to know it and how it functions, and that's how we can protect it. Yeah. Yes.
Thank you very much. I have, it's like a general comment. You see, there are some plant species which are the carbon tanks. And we know this thing of symbiotic association, where we benefit from plants, like animals benefiting from plants, and plants benefiting from animal as well. So how can we achieve the balance such that we have the equilibrium of biodiversity and climate change adaptation strategies?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, first of all, I think it's important to think about this as dynamic systems. Like ecosystems, if you think about it, the laws of thermodynamics, it's highly unlikely a system is actually going to be stable and not changing. Imagine the amount of energy that would be needed to keep a system in one place without moving. Like, nothing moves, nothing dies, nothing new comes in, it all stays the same. That's not how nature works. We're constantly in fluctuation, and that's a very good thing. That's actually what helps promote diversity. But I think what you're asking is how we can get better at doing our restoration work while paying attention to climate adaptation and mitigation. And I definitely do not think that is rocket science, because rocket science is really difficult. I certainly don't think that I could ever imagine how to get a rocket into the air, but figuring out what species need to be planted somewhere, like in a wetland buffer, or you're restoring a remnant forest, we have now a lot of information. For Rwanda, we have created ecosystem type maps for the country, and we know what species can be planted there. And we can also do carbon sequestration measures, and we have ways of measuring their contribution to climate events. I'm talking about like these extreme, that issue of attribution. We know that they may be caused by climate change, heavy rainfall or drought events. So we can have all that information together. And I really do believe that paying attention to biodiversity is very important in this whole process of addressing the climate change. You know, in some cases it is okay to have those non-native introduced species because they can play a role, especially in food systems. And I'm talking about the whole food system. It might be for humans, but also for livestock. But we have a lot of, I mean, again, we are in a biodiversity hotspot here. We have hundreds of native plant species in Rwanda, and you cannot tell me that all of them grow slower than every single tree that we've been introducing for other purposes. So I think it's really putting heads together to come up with the schemes for that. And I think it's close. There's been a lot of really good models of that in the different restoration projects that have been done already here in Rwanda. Yeah. Is there time for another question? I hope a female will ask a question, because one thing I have noticed is that we need more women in the science, please, in social and natural sciences. And I really hope some of you women ask some questions too.
Apologies, you know, I have gray hairs, I'm male.
I do too. You don't need to apologize.
Beth, thank you very much. This was a wonderful introduction to biodiversity in Rwanda. My name is Henry Viers. I'm policy advisor with the Ministry of Environment here in Rwanda. Just one point, you know, it's quite interesting. Rwanda has a pretty much outdated biodiversity policy from 2016. This is just being updated. This is, I think, a piece of information which is quite important. It's being updated, there's a revision of it, and it will be integrated also with the wildlife policy of the Rwanda Development Board. In the past, the elephants were under Rwanda Development Board, anything else was under a different setup. One point also which is interesting, Rwanda always looks for additional resources and financial resources, and so climate related issues were always high on the agenda. We are now seeing a whole variety of new budget possibilities which are related to biodiversity. I'm German, you know, there's the International Climate Initiative, where 1/3 of the entire budget goes on biodiversity related initiatives.
That's amazing.
We are seeing, you know, a number of these issues now as part of this COP15. So this is probably another additional financial window for Rwanda to follow. That's just as a remark. I just wanted to...
Yeah, thank you. I really hope that the biodiversity scientists in the country, and again, I see some of my colleagues in here, are invited to contribute to that policy. I'm pretty sure they will be. But also, again, I want to emphasize Rwanda has a Center of Excellence in Biodiversity and Natural Resource Management that really could be strengthened and highlighted. It's filled with some really amazing Rwandan scientists, both senior and much younger, and they're doing interdisciplinary work, and that center was designed with support from UNESCO to function as a consortium, and I think that that's where it can really provide, I mean, it really needs to be feeding data products that inform policy and working with all these other amazing institutions in the country. You're not female either.
Thank you. John Van Moss is my name, and I do some work with REMA on climate vulnerability. I know that Rwanda is a signature to the Convention on Biodiversity, and under that convention, the signatures have obligations, and Rwanda reports frequently to that. And that convention also lays out advisories on strategies and ways to proceed. I know that Rwanda is also cooperating a lot with IUCN, and it also has definitions and advisories on how to do things. Well, today I got an email that said that GIZ has just published a book that relates the CBD requirements for nature-based solutions to the IUCN guidelines, so that there's a way forward with that. And I thought, since this is a GIZ-sponsored event, that it might be interesting to know that that just came out today.
I also want to say something maybe a little bit radical related to that. At some point, we really need to prioritizing the Rwandan researchers doing this work, because I know there's a lot of development partners and a lot of the consultancies, and Rwandan researchers get involved often as sort of side partners, but I think they need to be front and center, because there needs to be ownership of these projects, ownership of the portals that are developed, ownership of, you know, the evaluations that are done, because I've noticed a big gap between, you know, a lot of these things happening in that world of, you know, the big NGOs, IUCN, et cetera, who are doing great work, by the way, and then on the ground, the researchers who may not always be aware of that or how to implement it. And as long as that doesn't happen, it's much slower to move forward. So I think all of you in these agencies could really do a lot where that capacity doesn't exist, and you think you want to say, I'm going to hire an international consultant. No, invest in building the capacity here, because that's really what's going to develop the sustainability, the durability of those policies and strategies and projects. Yeah. Oh, a female. Yay. Thank you.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. My name is Orvin. I need some clarification. I don't know much about biodiversity, but I need to know if there is any connection between biodiversity and biomass. Because when you are talking about carbon storage from plant, I was thinking that how much the country will know how much carbon is stored in the plant according to, I don't know much about it, but I think the plant stored the carbon according to the type of that plant. So I need to know how the country will assess all biomass available to have real data on that, so that the country will be able to know according to this ton of biomass is available, we are able to save this amount of carbon dioxide. Thank you.
So this is where we get to the co-benefits, or the cautionary tale, or a great paper in science called Forests Are More Than Sticks of Carbon. We cannot just think about carbon like a forest is just carbon, and that's all we're targeting. That way I call that missed opportunities, because we also have many other problems. We are losing biodiversity. Planting just the trees that sequester the most carbon are only going to get us like one check mark, and not all the others related to biodiversity conservation, promoting traditional knowledge, all other benefits from mixed species or promoting biodiversity. And we also know from ecological theory that diversity, so a mix of different species, is going to be more productive. So there's actually been some really great work by Maurice, and then maybe Gaspar, you can say his other name, but he did some really great work on carbon sequestration across the country and measuring that. And that paper is available, or if you want to contact me, I can share it. And it's not that difficult to measure the carbon sequestration based on the biomass. You need the biomass. And actually, also in the audience is Miriam Mujawa Maria, who works with a research group doing that work and looking at like fine scale detail and ecophysiology and how that's impacting carbon sequestration. So there's already a lot of work done here, and I just want to emphasize it's not just about how much carbon you take. I really urge to look at an ecosystem, a functioning ecosystem, and then what is the measure of the carbon in that ecosystem. And the biomass measurement for plants is not that difficult to get, and you want to have that diversity because you want those co-benefits. Did I answer that question? Not really. Sorry? Oh, can I give that to you? She said time.
Thank you very much for the good presentation and the very interesting one. No comment. It was a very interesting. Human beings are making biodiversity. We depend on biodiversity, and when there is climate change impacts, we are also impacted. We need to preserve the biodiversity for the benefit of all of us. It is another homework. Now the next session is having our break. We have 15 minutes. From this time, 10:35, 38, we'll be joining the parallel sessions, and the boardroom remains unchanged. Stream C will remain here. Stream D will join the second floor. Let us use our time wisely because we are a bit late. We have 15 minutes break. Enjoy. Thank you.